Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading another book. This is Dissolving the Ego and Realizing the Self by Dr. David R. Hawkins, and we left off with more definitions of the nature of the ego. We'll finish that up right now. To the ego, abandoning the self-reward dynamic is looked upon as a loss. The ego does not trust God and thereby thinks it has only itself to turn to for sustenance, survival, and pleasure. The ego has faith in its own mechanisms and not in God. It should be faulted for its error because it has no experiential basis for comparison. Its only way out is with faith that there is a better way. It hears a spiritual truth and begins to search for it when the mind becomes disillusioned with its own fallacies and failure to achieve happiness. It finally realizes that the grim satisfaction it squeezes out of pain is a poor substitute for joy. To the ego, gains lie within. To the spirit, they are internal. For the ever-present joy of existence is independent of content or form. To the spirit, a sunny day or a rainy day are the same. Awareness enjoys qualities rather than grasping at form. Thus, it can enjoy being without having to own or control. Awareness is not driven by goals, but instead values the capacity for equal pleasure in all circumstances. The ego's rigidity and resistance to correction are based on narcissistic egotism, pride, and vanity. The collective egos of whole nations bring about their downfall and destruction. The ego is not only unable to correctly assess situations that are fatal, but it even willingly sacrifices life for its own ends. The ego is therefore potentially deadly and would rather see you dead than admit to its wrong. The ego conceals, whereas awareness reveals. The answer to many defective ego positions could be subsumed in the commonly overlooked sanity of common sense. At the higher levels, the ego is seen to be an illusion, without any innate reality. At its root, the ego is the extreme of selfishness, and is completely lacking in all ethical principles. The ego is a victim of itself. With rigorous introspection, it will be discovered that the ego is really just running a racket for its own fun and games and survival. The real you is actually the loser. The ego clings to emotionality, which is intimately connected with its personalities. It pretends to think that it has no other choices. To surrender to God means to stop looking to the ego for solace and thrills and to discover the endless, serene joy of peace. To look within is to find the underlying ever-present source of the illumination of the mind itself. The ego defends its own limitations with prideful denial, thus becoming its own victim. From a developmental analysis which utilizes consciousness research techniques, it appears that the human ego itself is primarily the product and continuation of the presence of the survival core of animal evolution. In contrast to the innate arrogance of the ego, true intelligence is a quality of consciousness, awareness, and is not subject to attack because its essence is nonlinear. It is, however, utilized by the ego in its expression as mind, which then becomes and subserves the ego's drive for survival. Thus, the ego really uses the mind as camouflage and becomes hidden in its clever constructions. The recognition clarifies why the ego's masquerade as religion and undermining the spiritual truths have been central to its domination of the large cultures for extended periods of time and deaths of millions. The persistence of the primitive ego in man is referred to as the narcissistic core of egotism, which at calibration levels below 200 indicate the persistence of the primitiveness of self-interest, disregard for the rights of others, and seeing others as enemies and competitors rather than as allies. There is nothing deadlier than religionized ego. Well, that makes sense. This is a reading that I find interesting. It certainly keeps me off balance in terms of my reading ability, which I admittedly am not a great reader. I think that there's something that is being said here that is of value, but the way in which it's written, it does keep me off balance. I think what I just read there is a deep truth that I would say the millennial and beyond generations in the United States would highly relate to as a largely agnostic generations, even atheistic. It's a disillusionment, a disenchantment with organized religion, an organized religion that does seem to be more so based in appearance and optics, more so than spiritual truth and spiritual seeking, which is the true core purpose of religion. And that's why they wrote books. They wrote books to teach people about human truths, deep human truths, back in thousands of years ago. It's not really about culture. It's about deep human individual truths that we all are going to challenges we're all going to face at some level or another, and whether we can overcome them or not. While the ego self routinely takes credit for survival, its true source is the presence of divinity as self. It is only because of the self that the ego is capable of being self-sustaining. It is just a recipient of life energy and not its origin, as it believes. The ego is the main hero or heroine in the inner movie of one's life. The clever ego expresses its inner grandiosity by seeking to replace divinity by declaring itself to be God, or Nero, or Caesar, or so on, or claiming divine authority by its declaration that it is divinity ordained and therefore authorized. Ego positions have the characteristics of disowning responsibility and placing blame out there. In the end, the ego's payoff is the energy by which the ego persists because it lacks the pleasure of the input of spiritual energy. The ego's payoff is its substitute for divinity. Thus, it maintains its sovereignty and is convincing in its secret, silent belief that it is the source of life itself, that is, that it is God. On its own, the ego would never seek salvation. The mechanism for salvation is via the will, which invites the intervention of divinity. To the ego, a want is interpreted as a need, and to the ego, a want is interpreted as a need, and a have to have. Thus, its seeking can become frantic, and all caution can be thrown to the wind. desire, and thereby escalated by to being desperate and demanding any sacrifice, including even the death of millions of other people. It must have what it wants at any cost and will find many excuses to justify itself. It gets rid of reason with clever rhetoric bolstered by blame and demoralizes others, for the ego has to win at all costs. Because throughout millions of years of evolution, it did die if it did not get what it wants and needs fulfilled. The ego has a long, long memory and millions of years of reinforcement. And this goes back to yesterday's core concept, which was the ego exists in all of us. The ego is a common entity that human beings live with. It's just varying degrees of which the ego has its grip on an individual. But it is the same ego. That's how we can relate to one another. We have similar spiritual parts as other human beings, which is why people can... Why is it that art that's relatable is good? It's because we're relating to the sameness within us. If you don't see that, change your glasses prescription, because it's there. The ego structure is dualistic and splits the unity of reality into contrasting pairs and seeming opposites that are therefore the product and content of perception, which consist of projections. The ego's position propagates itself because its secretly sought payoff is the emotion itself. The inflated ego is devoid of reality testing as well as ameliorating by reason, logic, and rationality. Addiction to the ego's proclivities is like intoxication, where pleasure is derived from the emotional payoff of negativity. Thus, negative positionalities tend to be self-perpetuating habits akin to addiction, based on presumptions that the inner seductive lure of the gratification of basic animal instincts. By repetition, they eventually gain dominance and control, which is the innate purpose of the narcissistic ego in the first place. The levels below calibration 200 tend to be self-propagating because the seductive emotional pleasures of the ego's animal instinct pay off. There's some sort of a chart that goes along with this book that I think I have in print somewhere, but is not yet been mentioned in this book, although it's been written down. They haven't shown the actual chart yet, which is probably not optimal if you're going to reference some sort of chart. The ego is oriented toward specifics on the linear content of the field of vision. Its effect on vision itself is exclusive and limited in order to focus primarily on the near side of objects, so as to facilitate manipulation. Spirit is oriented toward context in the whole, and is thus inclusive and focused on the far side of objects. Its field is diffused rather than local. In ordinary life, the ego, or mind, goes from unfinished to finished, and then from incomplete to complete. In contrast, the spiritual pathway is a direction and style that goes from complete to complete as evolutionary states of emergence. Ego positions are interactive and usually present a composite. For example, to disassemble anger may require the willingness to surrender the pride that underlies that anger, which in turn depends on surrendering a desire. This means surrendering the fear that energizes the desire, which again is related to the undoing of imaginary loss and so forth. Motivations are thus intertwined and mutually interactive, and operationally surrendering them leads to the next level, which are comprised of dualities. Thus, the deeper layers tend to surface one's belief about God, programmed spiritual expectations and belief systems. Spiritual work is therefore a matter of exploration that transcends mental concepts such as those of the cause and effect. The ego's survival relies on defeat of truth because it is dependent on allegiance to falsity. For one thing, spiritual truth challenges the ego's presumption that it is sovereign. The ego is addicted to being right. For example, in politics, a prevailing goal of the ego is to be right. Therefore, it is core of the payoff of righteousness. You can be right without being righteous, and you can be righteous without being right. The ego is focused on one point, the experiencer, which is programmed to seek pleasure and survival through gain. It views happiness as something one acquires, possesses, and incorporates. Therefore, the experiencer is programmed to get. The experiencer's function is to get pleasure and possess it. It is not concerned with the soul unless it fortuitously becomes spiritually oriented. Then its goals shift, and it is discovered that the source of pleasure is completely within. When it is discovered that the source of ongoing pleasure is self, the result is independence from the world. Gratification of the ego's desires is within a linear domain. True happiness arises from the non-linear. The relinquishment of dependence on the experiencer for pleasure and happiness. One discovers that the source of happiness is one's own experience. Notice that the experiencer's aspect of ego is constantly poised to derive benefit from the witness and phenomena, even if it's only confirm its own reality as being the you. If the ever-presumptuous personal I, the ego is reluctant to accept the unfolding of sequential phenomena, is autonomous and impersonal. It is poised to jump in to impose a feeling, which in turn is always the expression of an ego viewpoint or positionality, such as an opinion, or at least in order to declare itself to be primordially essential to one's identity and sense of reality. To cease identifying the experiencer as the reality of oneself is a major transition from dualistic content to non-dualistic context, and therefore from self to self. The ego is not the actual reality of or source of life or existence, and is therefore vulnerable to dissolution. It is primordial, but not essentially sovereign. It is dominant only until its illusionary quality is recognized. In the human, there evolved not only the capacity to process the interpret linear data, but there was also available a nonlinear energy of consciousness and awareness that was called spiritual, because the energy source was non-physical and not definable by linear concepts. This too was evolutionary in its human development and was called the human spirit. It was characterized by the emergence of a non-physical energy body and survival of the evolution of which were interdependent of the physical body itself. Thus, spiritual, it is related to essence and reason, to nonlinear form and definition, As can be seen from the evolutionary development, faith was a biological necessity for survival that was built into a basic structure of ego as the sense of self. The capacity to be aware and experience the self was a quality of sentient awareness initial to the animal kingdom. Thus, humankind lived by faith naively. The ego placed its primary faith in narcissistic core of the ego itself, which therefore assumed autonomy and sovereignty as the arbiter of reality. The ego is, by virtue of its structure and origin, blind to its own limitations. The absolute subjectivity of revealed truth precludes all considerations or uncertainties which stem only from the ego. When the ego collapses, all argument ceases and is replaced by silence. Doubt is the ego. That the mind is unable to prove a position does not mean that a proposition is false. This is the pitfall of the atheist because the mind is unable to know what is true. It is simultaneously equally unable to disprove it, for it would even be the paradox of having to prove its opposite. The narcissistic core of the ego unconsciously and naively presumes that it is omnipotent and therefore lacks the humanity that is requisite to arriving at the higher truth. Paradoxically, benefit is derived by the self-interest of the ego when it begins to realize that this is a great advantage to unselfishness. When it learns of the benefit of letting go of egocentric goals, the ego itself then becomes the springboard to spiritual inquiry, and the meaning to its own transcendence, realizing that humanity is strength and not weakness, and that wisdom is not ignorance. The willingness to forgive and forget calibrates at 450, where reason and logic reside. The willingness to forgive and to surrender to God calibrates at 540, unconditional love. That's the ego, according to Dr. David R. Hawkins. God bless. Goodbye.